Hi everyone, welcome back to another lecture. Last time we finished the fifth PowerPoint by discussing the proposed end of the slave trade, right? How in the Constitution the Founding Fathers basically said that they expect the slave trade to be illegal in 20 years, but they left it open um, so that the South wouldn't get too mad about it, and that they assumed they had an opportunity to change that decision, but it ended up ending in 1808, the proposed date that they had for that. And then we started the sixth PowerPoint, right, which we're going to continue today. Last time we talked about gradual emancipation in the North and how many northern states felt that even before the end of the war, that they could not fight for the ideals of the founding of America, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, by owning slaves. So we talked about the first two states who did that, right? Pennsylvania, who did it pretty early on, and Massachusetts, who followed a few years after that. So today we're going to finish that particular topic with a few more states, and then we're going to discuss when we decided what we were going to do with a bunch of land that we got from this from the war, and how we created a bunch of new states, and what the question of slavery was for those states. As you can see, the first two states we're going to talk about are Connecticut and Rhode Island. If you take a look at video A, not too many videos today, but you've seen in previous lectures it kind of fluctuates based on the topic. In video A, it talks about slavery in Connecticut, okay, which maybe some of you don't know where Connecticut is because it's one of those small states, right? So is Rhode Island. Connecticut and Rhode Island both instituted gradual emancipation plans by way of legal statutes, meaning that they put into law sort of their plans for gradual emancipation. In both states, the Revolutionary War started the process of emancipation because both enlisted slaves to fill troop requirements during the war. Okay, so remember we talked about the Revolution and how some states would buy slaves? Well, both of these states did that. In Connecticut, a 1777 enlistment bill failed to pass, but they did pass a bill that fall that allowed slave owners to free healthy slaves without any further financial responsibility. So we can assume from this fact that, if the slave owners in Connecticut in particular free their slaves, that they would need to free them and then make sure that they were taken care of, right? Sort of like indentured servants, where maybe provide them with land or money or some sort of opportunity to make sure that they don't live off the state. This picture is an example of a slave from this particular area, right? Either Connecticut or Rhode Island. And you can see he's holding a paintbrush, so indicating some sort of trade that that particular slave took up. This encouraged owners to free their slaves in exchange for them serving as substitutes in the army. Rhode Island passed an enlistment bill in 1778 where slaves were manumitted and offered soldiers' benefits, and the owner was compensated up to 120 pounds. This is quite a lot that Rhode Island did, right? So basically what it was they passed a bill that said if you free your slaves, you get 120 pounds, and the slaves get soldiers' benefits, meaning they get pay and they get veteran status potentially, and maybe a pension, although I doubt it because not a lot of black soldiers, even in later wars, got good pensions. A pension, by the way, is money that you receive in old age based on your job or maybe your veteran status. For example, when Harriet Tubman, years after the Civil War, she received a pension for her military service. Okay, pensions are more of our grandparents type of thing now because businesses don't necessarily want to fork over the money, Less than 100 slaves were freed under this bill, and it was quickly repealed after the next election cycle because there was so much opposition to it. So bad news, guys, right? Like, the state was pretty ambitious with this, but they reversed his decision because it seemed like a lot of money. A 1779 Rhode Island bill that outlawed the sale of slaves outside the state. Okay. So you couldn't take slaves out of Rhode Island and sell them, right? Or maybe necessarily you couldn't buy slaves outside the state too and bring them into Rhode Island. That's one way that states sort of slowed down the increase of slavery in their territories is if you're not bringing in new slaves, then maybe they thought slavery would die over time. The legislature did pass a bill, however, that allowed owners to manumit healthy slaves between the ages of 21 and 40 as long as they presented them to the town for inspection and the slaves were deemed healthy and able to support themselves. Okay. Most states were concerned that freed slaves would be lazy or delinquent and would fall to the care of the state as paupers or poor people, right? So basically, you'd have to go through a thorough health examination, make sure you're able to work, and then that potentially you can get a job so that you didn't live off the state. Rhode Island also passed a bill that allowed for gradual emancipation. Also in 1784, Connecticut consolidated earlier slave codes, keeping slavery legal, but putting a penalty on importing slaves into the state and instituting gradual emancipation. So again, if you don't bring in new slaves, you slowly get rid of slavery, but you still get to keep your slaves ultimately. Both the Connecticut and Rhode Island bills declared that children born to slaves after March 1st, 1784 would be free, but would serve their mother's master until they reach their majority, right? Means a certain age, right? For Connecticut, that's 25 years. For Rhode Island, it's about 18 years for women and 21 years for men. An amendment to the Rhode Island law the following year made it 21 years of service for both male and female children and reduced the age limit for voluntary manumission from 40 to 30. Okay, so sort of keeping parameters on who gets freed and who does not. Right. These two states, right, aren't pretty small, right? They don't have a huge impact in government, but they did take some initiative to free the slaves, so that's what we're kind of talking about. And I believe this is Connecticut as well. Didn't find a lot of pictures of old Rhode Island, but this is what those towns look like. Very packed together, very poor sewage systems, you know, pretty gross. And then here are some general facts about multiple states. So this is called New Hampshire and others, although we'll talk about a couple more states after this. New Hampshire was a very small state as well, saw an ambiguous process of emancipation. The state's 1783 Constitution stated that all men were free and equal, mirroring the rhetoric of the Revolution. However, in 1784, slaves were still considered taxable property, meaning they're not people, and the state can collect taxes based on how many slaves there were. There were very diverse opinions on slavery in the state, and the institution gradually died out without a formal abolition plan. So not only was the state small, which kind of helped, but also they didn't put a formal plan out, right? It just, over time, slavery just went away in the state, right? No increase, but a gradual decrease. Slaves continued to be counted on the federal census in New England until 1840. Now, you guys might be familiar with the census. We're doing it this year, right? Basically, every 10 years, the government counts who lives where, and that determines how many taxes your town and your state gets based on how many people live there. So it's very important to count yourselves in the census. Rhode Island, Connecticut passed bills banning slavery in 1843 and 1848, respectively, and New Hampshire passed a final abolition bill in 1857. And here is another abolitionist sort of paper or flyer, right, convincing people to free their slaves. So it took some time for these states to officially abolish slavery, right? People think that the northern states either didn't have slaves or they freed them super early in our history, but that's simply not true, right? it took a very long time for a lot of them, right? 1857 is 3 or 4 years before the Civil War. That's quite close, right? When the North was criticizing the South for slavery, many of them still had slaves. So it's very ironic. So we have 3 more states to cover, right? The first 2 are New York and New Jersey, who we discussed specifically when we covered colonial slavery. And here is a flyer, this picture of a runaway slave sort of making a testimony about how he escaped from Baltimore, Maryland. As you'd see flyers around this too for abolitionist causes. So New York and New Jersey held on to slavery for longer than their northern neighbors. New York tried to pass a gradual plan in 1785, but it was rejected by the Council of Revision, which is like a political council in New York, because it did not give African Americans the right to vote. So it's kind of like, it was a little too ambitious to New Yorkers, right? They sort of stopped themselves because they're like, well, if we free these people, why can't they vote? And then some people are like, no, what the heck? Like, it was just an argument. This stalled the legislation, and abolition was delayed another 14 years. The only change during that period was the banning of the slave trade, with loopholes, meaning that people could get around these rules, and the abolition of special courts that held the power of life and death over slaves, both in 1788. In 1799, the state passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery that had a plan similar to Pennsylvania's. Children born to slaves after July 4, 1799, were free at 28 for men and 25 for women, and slaves already in servitude remained in bondage but were reclassified as indentured servants. So we've heard this before, right? Instead of freeing them, you just ensure they're still slaves but under a contract. 18 years later, New York issued a second statute that gave freedom to slaves born before the 4th of July in 1799, starting on July 4th, 1827. Okay, so you had to be at least 29 in order to be freed, right? With the second statute, the state gave themselves a 10-year grace period for slavery to die out in the state. So it's sort of dragging their feet a little bit. If you take a look at video B, it talks more about, the ending of slavery in New York, right? Because New York is one of the biggest states we have as far as population goes, very popular state, so very important to discuss slavery in that context. And here's an example of a black man being tied to some sort of pole, maybe getting abused, and a couple men trying to fight his abuser in New York. And this picture is of the New Jersey Abolitionist Society. This is from a book of maybe speeches and pictures and things talking about freeing slaves. So again, in 1877, New York passed freedom if you were born before the 4th of July, 1799. In an opposite trend to New England, slavery actually grew in New Jersey in the decades after the Revolution. New Jersey passed their gradual abolitionist law on July 4th, 1804. They love the 4th of July, apparently. Stating that the children of slaves born after that date would be free after serving their mother's master for 25 years if male and 21 years if female. Again, they're trying to get as much labor out of you as possible. This meant that gradual emancipation would not start until the 1820s, and there were still slaves bound for life. April 18, 1846 was celebrated as Emancipation Day in New Jersey, but there was still functional slavery in the state until the passage of the 13th Amendment. Okay, so Again, that's important, right? The 13th Amendment was passed in 1863, so New Jersey had slaves for quite a long time. And again, it's ironic because they were in the Union, which fought against slavery, and yet they still owned slaves. So this is a chart showing various states and what slavery looked like in those states. Okay, from 1790 to 1860. So as you can see, right, New Hampshire, which we said gradually emancipated, from 1790 to 1800 decreased quite a bit, and then they really didn't have very many slaves, right? Massachusetts didn't. These numbers aren't just like they had one slave or, this indicates like thousands. And when you get to like Pennsylvania, Delaware, DC, Kentucky, there's way more slaves, right? So feel free to take a look at that. Now, the final state we're going to talk about is a very small state. It's where my sister lives, coincidentally, and I mentioned before was the last state to emancipate or adopt the 13th Amendment, which formally got rid of slavery in this country. So the state of Delaware. So Delaware held on to slavery the longest, even past when the institution was profitable for the state. So even when they couldn't make money off of slaves, they still had slaves. Delaware had a unique path to emancipation. Caught between the North and South geographically, it did not abandon slavery like the states to the north, nor did it entrench into the institution like its neighbors to the south. So this means that even though they didn't free their slaves like the North, they didn't necessarily make slavery a central part of their economy like the South unfortunately did. Privately, some Delaware slave owners freed their slaves, created indentured type agreements, so making contracts again, or fashioned their own gradual emancipation agreements by retaining their rights to labor in their slaves' most productive years and then freeing them. So basically the same as the other northern states. Because of private action, slavery did decrease significantly from 70% of the black population in 1790 to only 8% in 1860, but that's quite a lot of time to do that, right? Because slaves made up 20% of the population, they could be a valuable political voice for whoever captured the loyalty of that community. Thus, Democrats seeking to keep them from gaining that political role by keeping the institution of slavery intact. Okay, so let me explain that briefly. Which, by the way, here is this is Delaware's sort of signature on sort of getting rid of slavery in one way or another, right? So if you guys are in high school, right? So maybe you haven't learned too much about Democrats versus Republicans. Modern Democrats are more liberal in that they believe in social programs, essential government, sort of like helping more people. The Republican Party today is more conservative. They believe in saving money. They don't necessarily like social programs as much, and they believe in less government interference. Now, the parties were different before the 1960s when President Kennedy took office. So basically switch the ideals of the party and you have what they used to be, right? The Democrats used to be very conservative. They were pro-slavery. The Republicans were anti-slavery and they were very liberal, okay? So people often get that confused because President Lincoln was a Republican, but basically he would be a Democrat if he was around today, okay? So I like to explain that to my students because it seems kind of confusing when I bring that up. And this points to the fact that it was super important for many people to sort of rig the system, right? By keeping the majority of black people in Delaware enslaved, they could determine who won the elections, right? Because if the majority of black people are freed, do you think they're going to vote for the Democratic Party that won slavery? No. They're going to vote for the Republicans, and the Democrats don't have power anymore. So that's partly why they kept slaves even if they weren't very profitable anymore. Technically, the 13th Amendment ended slavery in Delaware. However, the state was the last to ratify the amendment, as I mentioned, meaning they adopted the amendment into their constitution. Okay. The state constitution. Each state has a different constitution. When you pass an amendment like the Voting Rights Amendment for women, the states have to adopt that into their individual constitution. Okay, it's a whole process. They actually didn't ratify the 13th Amendment until 1901, which is like almost 50 years later, right? No, almost 40 years later. The only non-seceded state that opposed the amendment into the 20th century. Under these gradual policies, not much changed for slaves. Many slaves remained in bondage. Freedom was delayed for children, and much of the status quo remained in society. So even if you were freed, you were still treated poorly because you were black. This is not to discount the shift that did occur in the period after the Revolution. Many slaves were freed individually during or after the Revolutionary War, and there was certainly an increased discussion about issues of slavery and race in the North. However, it is clear that only in New England did slavery die quickly. In the rest of the northern states, the process was very slow, and slavery still had a presence up until the Civil War. Clearly, the line between free and slave in antebellum America was not as solid as sometimes presented. So, antebellum period, maybe you've heard this word before, right? Jordan Peele, the director of Us and Get Out, has a movie coming out called Antebellum. It's basically the period before the Civil War, right? When slavery is still pretty huge in this country, and the South is benefiting from it and sort of shaping their culture around slave owning, right? That's the antebellum period. So here's a depiction of a freed slave, sort of praising the heavens, I guess, in freedom. So our last topic for today, remember all that sweet land we got from England for winning the war? We had to decide what we were going to do with it, right? Are we going to make it into new states? How many states are we going to make it into? And are those states going to become slave states? Right? Throughout this class, we're going to continue talking about that because we have many more states to add to this country before the end of this class. So every time that they added new states, they had to determine this, right? Are they going to be free states? Are they going to be slave states? Who's going to have the power in our government? So this is the Ohio region. So that's mainly what we're talking about. So this was called the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. If you look at video C, there's more information about this, and this picture is a historical marker sort of explaining the ordinance. Okay, so again, this is our last topic for today, so let's get into it. The territory west of the Appalachian Mountains was called Ohio Country, which consisted of Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. After Great Britain had acquired the territory via the Treaty of Paris in 1763, remember I discussed the 7 Years' War and how Britain defeated the French, they got all this new land, and they wouldn't let us settle on it because they didn't want to piss off the Native Americans, right? The British Crown tried to prevent the American colonists, as I mentioned, from expanding into this territory. Although Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Virginia held claims on the land after the Revolutionary War, so all these states, right, again, Massachusetts, New York, Connecticut, and Virginia actually wanted to make their states bigger with the land. But Thomas Jefferson convinced them instead to let Ohio Country turn into several new states. This became the Land Ordinance of 1784, which intended to turn the territory into 10 small states. This ordinance would transform into the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which we're talking about, formerly known as an ordinance for the government of the territory of the United States northwest of the River Ohio. Now, that's a lot to say, so that's why we just shorten it to the Northwest Ordinance. It's quite a lot. It created the Northwest Territory, which was the first organized territory in the United States. The ordinance also established fee simple ownership, which gave landowners the power to sell or give away their land whenever they wanted to. Now, this is huge because when England owned us, you had to go through your state governor in order to get land, right? You had to maybe sign a contract where if they gave you this land, then you maybe volunteer for military service, or you had to pay certain taxes in order to even buy the land. Well, now that's out the window. It was also called the first guarantee of freedom of contract in the United States, again, meaning that you didn't have to pay somebody just to sell or buy your land. In general, Congress had the power to determine the distribution of these lands into new states rather than having some already established states determine what to do with the land. This new ordinance also allocated for the creation of 5 new states: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Once they reached a population of at least 60,000 people, they would officially be recognized as states. So that was usually how we determined that a new state was official, right? If you reach 60,000, then you're good. Of course, that was pretty damn quick for California. So here it is. Article 6 of the Northwest Ordinance says, "There shall be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the said territory, otherwise than in the punishment of crimes thereof the party shall have been duly convicted, provided always that any person escaping into the same, from whom labor or service is lawfully claimed in any one of the original states, such fugitive may be lawfully reclaimed and conveyed to the person claiming his or her labor or service as aforesaid." So basically, the Northwest Ordinance guaranteed that these states would never become slave states. However, it did not prevent slave owners from recapturing slaves that ran away there. Okay. So there were concessions. This is the document of the Northwest Ordinance. Obviously, we can't read the text, unless you have a magnifying glass or something. The ordinance not only banned slavery in the new territory, but also had an indentured servant law, which allowed some slave owners to bring slaves under that status. So they sort of kept their slaves if they gave them contracts, right? They could not be bought or sold. Southern states voted for the law because they did not want to compete with the territory over tobacco as a commodity crop. It was so labor intensive that it was grown profitably only with slave labor. So essentially the South was on board just because they wanted to be the tobacco growers, and tobacco probably could have done really well in this territory. So they're like, nah. Additionally, slave states' political power would merely be equalized, as there were 3 more slave states than there were free states in 1790. So again, not only do we have to figure out if these territories are going to be free or slave based on our morals, right? But also the slave states and the free states are going to argue in the government for years until the end of the Civil War. So you have to make sure that one side doesn't have more government representation than the other, right? Or else things are going to go a certain way. So the South was always concerned about new free territories possibly taking away their power in government and potentially getting rid of slavery. This ordinance also permitted American citizens to settle in Native American held territories. So that was part of the ordinance, right? Now the people who went into the American Revolution because they couldn't settle on all this sweet land could do so now. And that was bad for the Native Americans, who often were killed or relocated to make way for these settlers. And here is what the territory looked like. Okay, so it shows too, like, when these states became official states. As you can see, it took Wisconsin quite a bit of time to become an official state, with Ohio being the first state. Okay, because remember, there weren't that many people in America during this time, so 60,000 is quite a lofty goal. So that's the end of today's lecture. We're done talking about the gradual emancipation of northern states. Next time we're going to get more into sort of freeing slaves and what to do with them, right? Talking about some people who wanted to send them back to Africa. We'll also talk about the process of freeing your slaves, aka manumission, which I've mentioned quite a few times. We'll also talk about a black woman who did a lot, and we'll also get a little bit more into free black people and what their lives look like during this time. But of course, that is going to follow our midterm, which is next week, right? So I hope you guys have an easy time studying. Don't worry too much. There's, as you can see from the review sheet, there's a lot of different categories of questions, so I'm sure that you guys will do fine, but do your best and don't use your notes to take the test.